So I know Jolt people are always up for a challenge for professional development, and I really hope this presentation today will help you and give you the challenge you're looking for. And if it's not enough of a challenge, then challenge me back, okay? So my topic is freedom of speech on the Japanese campus, and I'm not going to give a big self-introduction here in the beginning because it's also actually it's going to be part of the presentation later on. So let me just get into the aims for today. Next. Okay, here first, just to give you a sense of the flow, we're going today. We have 2 hours. So for the first hour, part one, I'll start with, oh, I forgot to change this. It's probably going to be more than 20 minutes, but it'll all work out. Okay, and then we'll have our first breakout discussion. And then we'll have time to share when you come back from the breakout discussion. Then I thought people might need a break so they're not sitting in front of the computer for 2 hours. And then for the second part, it's going to be kind of a workshop style where I'm going to provide a couple of scenarios for role plays and send you back into great breakout rooms to do those role plays. And then we've got a nice cushion, plenty of time at the end where then you'll also, again, share what you discovered in those role plays and then have some time for wrap up. Next. Okay, so these are the questions that were basically in the abstract that was on the poster and in the advertising. The first question is there robust exchange of views on controversial issues, or is there a sense that risky issues are taboo? Isn't freedom of speech essential for educating global citizens capable of expressing their views? And if students don't get this practice now, how will they be prepared to deal with controversy in the real world after they graduate? So, considering those questions and then working together to think about what's the best way then to support our peers and our students. And I just have that little hand mark there on the first question because I'd like to ask you just what your sense is on your campus, okay? How about your campus? Is there robust exchange of views on controversial issues? Please raise your hand if you feel that way about your teaching situation. Okay, or is there a sense in your situation that risky issues are taboo? Raise your hand if it's more on that end of the spectrum. Yeah.
Gerry, can I for a second? Would you like us to ask you questions all along, or do you want us to keep silent?
I'm going to be giving opportunities. Yeah, I hope enough that if I can keep on track. Yeah,
you want
especially using Google Meet for the first time. Yeah.
Okay. All
right. Okay. Next. Okay, so I do think it's important to start with a positionality statement, especially because I don't know everyone out there in the audience. I think a lot of you may be familiar with this wheel of privilege. There are many variations on this. I know it's kind of hard to see right there, but I will be enlarging it on the next slide. But for right now, I think people are familiar enough with it that you know that the center, as in post-colonial theory, is where all the power is concentrated, and it says privilege there. And basically, it's in 3 levels where the further you go out to the margins, the less power you have in your social situation. And so in this particular version of the Wheel of Privilege, there are 12 categories, or sort of 12 slices to the pie. And so I'm just going to come out here and be honest and say, okay, I'll admit, okay, I got a score of 11 to 12. So I'm in that area closest to the bull's eye. And, it's embarrassing to say that. And I could come up with all kinds of justifications. Well, I'm not really that powerful. I'm really not really that privileged. But that's part of the exercise today, is to realize we're always trying to justify and say, no, I'm not really that bad, But I think one thing is to acknowledge that and not to try to deny it, but rather to think, how can I use this privilege? How can I leverage this privilege to help level the playing field for everyone? So I did put over in the right-hand circle a few exceptions just to sort of highlight how our minds often work when we try to justify and, make ourselves look good, look better than this may make us look. So the possible exceptions there I've just given as examples. Skin color. Okay, I think I probably look pretty white on the screen there. Okay, I actually looked much more Asian when I was a child, especially because I spent a lot of time outdoors and I got a really big tan, whereas after 3 years in the pandemic and not being outside a lot, I'm really white right now. But I am actually mixed race, and so that doesn't really show up as clearly in the gradation on that slice of the pie there. Marital status, I'd like to make 2 points. One is that it doesn't distinguish, it has like divorced, never married, or married. And so the spectrum is, there's not a lot of nuance in the gradation there. So, for example, my marital status, yeah, I'm married, but to be honest, I'm in a common law marriage. I'm not legally married. Okay, so, and I mean, people don't come up to me at parties and say, hey, Gerry, are you really married? It doesn't come up that often. I can pass, but I think, as some of you may know, that it may become an issue like end of life care, things like that. And especially, I think, as we know, for our colleagues, sexual minorities, okay, LGBTQ folk that, cannot have their, even if they wanted to have a legal marriage, they couldn't. I have the option, but some people don't, that's more of an issue for them. Another thing about the gradation on this wheel of privilege, and I'm pointing these things out because I want to encourage all of you to, point out any flaws or, any areas of this wheel that you find lacking. And I think it's a constantly evolving conversation. But the other one I would say that's especially apropos to our situation here, where many of us, not all of us, but many of us are not Japanese. And as but this also applies, I think, to our Japanese colleagues as well, that the marital status definitely intersects with your gender. So for a man, marital status married is going to be a plus in the Japanese employment and hiring system. Whereas if you're a woman, married, I have colleagues who've gotten those questions at their interviews. So who's going to take care of the kids? And they assume that the woman's responsible. And so, it might be a minus or, a disadvantage to hire a woman with children because she might not do the job the way a man who has a stay-at-home wife does. And they make those assumptions about the men, even though the men, also, of course, their wives are not always stay-at-home wives. So those kinds of nuances are not reflected clearly here, but at least it's a starting point. It's a heuristic device we can use to get the conversations going. We just need to be aware of those nuances and not oversimplify.
Okay.
The housing there also, it's a little simplistic, either unhoused, renting, or own. And you could, nominally own something, but you could have a huge loan. You could have a huge mortgage that doesn't get reflected there. So there are little things like that I'm just mentioning because, just to remind everyone to be careful about how you score yourself. So, I mean, I might get down to like 10.5, but probably, this is not going to change my score that much just because of a few of those little adjustments. And then finally, personally, I found the greatest, the missing factor on this particular wheel is that it doesn't list nationality, citizenship. And I think this is a point worth paying attention to. Some of you may know colleagues, for example, who just consider the status, for example, of refugees or people from areas of conflict where they may be overseas now, they may be a dissident, or protesting about their own government's policies. If their passport, expires, they may not be very secure on whether they're going to be able to get their passport renewed or not. And so that's why nationality and citizenship are separated there. You can have the nationality, but if you can't get a passport, especially for political reasons, you might not have the citizenship that's represented by the passport. So that's another one of those nuances that I think would be, especially for us here in JALT, to be aware of. Okay, next. Okay, so that's just zooming in. If people just want to, if you want to take a screenshot of that, or just use it, remind yourself of those categories, because we are going to be kind of talking about this in your first breakout room. So I'll give you a minute there if you want to take a screenshot. Okay, next. Okay, so a little bit more background and sort of food for thought before we move into the breakout rooms. So we're going to be talking today especially about ways we can leverage our privilege. I mean, everyone's privilege, of course, there are different degrees. I've probably got, I've just shown, I know I have a lot more privilege and security than others. So, I'm not advising anyone to go out and just imitate what I do or take the same risks that I have sometimes taken, which I could do because I was in a more secure position. But just think about what you can do and just be aware of your own limits, but also don't get too fatalistic about it, and don't give up, and think about what you can do, or where you can get support. So this is my self-introduction now here. So I was very lucky. I came to Japan in the bubble era. Okay, so I was hired as an assistant professor in 1988, and I basically had lifelong employment from the start. And I was promoted to associate professor after the standard 7 years, and then promoted to full professor after the standard 7 years. So during the first years, the first sort of maybe naive, innocent years, okay, I was very active in social activism, and also especially with students and supporting students. And I know those images are too small to see, but they're just placeholders. And if you squint, you can see what I'm talking about. So the first image over there on the left is of a die-in. Okay, so that's an image of the sidewalk on our campus. And if you really squint, you can see there are chalk outlines of dead bodies. Okay, so we did the die-in. I don't know if anyone has ever done a die-in here. And what we do is we all lie down on the ground to pretend we've been killed in a war. And then we take turns drawing chalk outlines around each other. And then we stand up and we disappear, but the chalk outlines remain as a protest. So this was a protest against the Gulf War on our university campus. And then the image of the Japanese newspaper article on the right is, I think a lot of people here know that I was very active in the international anti-apartheid movement, demanding the release of Nelson Mandela. And here you can see a photo of me sitting with a group of students doing a hunger strike. And I was just very lucky. So again, I know a lot of people are not this lucky, but I just had a wonderful dean who supported me when I was doing these activities. And we even had parents call and say, hey, what is this professor doing there? Isn't she supposed to be working, teaching, shouldn't she be disciplined? And my dean totally supported me. And he actually lied for me sometimes. And he told these parents, he said, she was only doing the sit-in during lunch and after hours. And the fact that she was doing a hunger strike, it did not affect her work performance. And he totally covered for me. And I know, especially, that was 20, 30 years, 40 years ago. And I know things are not, that simple today, but we can dream, right? And then the bottom sign, the war on terrorism with the on crossed out and rewritten war is terrorism. Okay, so this is a sign I put on my office door after 9/11. And if any of you ever visited me between 2001 and my retirement in 2020, you saw this sign on my door because it was up there until I retired. So I was very lucky to have supportive, dean, supportive peers. But I'm not saying that I was doing this my whole 35-year career, so it's not a straight line, and I'm not putting this up here to ask for any special recognition for all the great things I did, but I do like to keep, the possibilities alive and think about, what we can do to, as not only for our own freedom of speech as faculty members, but, for our students also, because next what I want to talk about is, so in the earlier years, I was mainly just active together with the students. And sometimes they were actually covering me more than I was covering them. Like if they saw a police van with a video camera up at the top, they would all huddle around me so that the police couldn't get images of me because they knew foreigners may be more vulnerable. Um, but then that, there wasn't that so much that kind of activism, or people weren't coming to me with it anyway for quite a few years throughout my associate and full professor years. And it's actually after I retired that students started coming to me again. And so the example I have over there on the right, I'd like to tell you about is an event that was held last year at Ritsumeikan's Kyoto Museum for World Peace. And what happened was this student organization called KYMC, Kansai Youth Movement for Change, came to me and said they were planning this event at the Museum of World Peace, and they wanted me to give the keynote speech. And it was because they knew of my activism in the anti-apartheid movement. But it was just a wonderful event. There were Palestinian students, there were Israeli students, there were students who had served in the IDF, and they were actually sitting down and talking to each other. It was just an amazing event, and I really salute the students of KYMC for facilitating that and creating that opportunity. And then what they did after that first event, these students were from Ritsumeikan, but they wanted to establish chapters at other universities in the Kansai area. And so what they would do is they would make connections, they would find friends at the various universities, and then they would go and hold similar events on that campus and try to establish a chapter there. But then they started running into opposition. They actually ran, so they had on one campus, I'm not going to name any names here, but on one campus, they had one event, somebody complained, and so when they went back to hold their second event, they were told, no, we can't, let you use our facilities anymore. And then when they came to my university, and then one of the students at my university tried to get permission to use a classroom to do a film showing. And they were told, no, you cannot unless you have, because you're not an official, officially recognized circle, koshiki. And so you can only do it if you have a faculty sponsor. And so they came to me and asked me to sponsor. And so I signed the forms, and they were able to. But then we kept hearing rumors about other students at other campuses who were trying to do this and not being able to get permission. And so what I did was then, this is just an example of the kind of things, however you may feel moved, is I wrote this message and I gave it to the students. And I said, anytime you go to your university and try to, have an event and you encounter resistance, show them this letter. And I gave it to them in Japanese and English. And I know the print is small, so I would like to read it. I wrote, a university has a solemn duty to educate a new generation of global leaders seeking to realize their vision of a safer, more peaceful, and more secure world. These students have such a vision. They have a vision of a just peace. They have a dream of a world free of occupation and apartheid. They know we must strike at the roots of conflict. They know that the struggle for a just peace is intersectional and that a people united will never be defeated. I urge your university to protect their freedom of speech on your campus so that their voices are heard around the world. They are our hope for the future. And let me just add that although that first event at the Kyoto Museum for World Peace was about Israel and Palestine, that is not the only focus. As I said, the name of the organization is Kansai Youth Movement for Peace. And this was just one of the many issues that they take up. They also do like Kurdish refugees and, other issues. It's not a single issue organization. Okay, next. Okay, so here's another example of a way we can leverage our privilege, and this is more related to our activities in the classroom. I don't know how many of you, I did an interview on OTJ TV about this. And so you can see that on YouTube if you're interested in, but maybe many of you are familiar with this idea. Oh, I talked about it at Living on the Edge also last year. But anyway, the parsnips, this idea that textbook publishers, there's this rumor, or, I don't know if it's an urban legend or what, that textbook publishers want you to avoid writing about these topics in your textbooks: politics, alcohol, religion, sex, narcotics, ideology, and pork. Um, and that has been sort of ballooned, and it's been expanded and snowballed into this idea that not only should we not publish these things in our textbooks, but we shouldn't even talk about them in the classroom. And it has been taken as a kind of taboo. And I'd really like for us to pause today and think about, is that really true here in Japan? Because the person who wrote, first coined this, well, actually, this quote I give you here is from a blog post by Scott Thornberry, who's quite famous in ELT, and his blog post was titled "T is for Taboo." But he's quoting from Diane Ravitch, who was, I think, at one time the secretary of the Department of Education in the United States. So very much talking about the American situation. But what I want you to think about, as we always need to think about, is that, a lot of our English language sources are very monocultural. So we need to be flexible and really think about to what degree they apply to our situation. But let's take a look, because it does seem to have had a very strong influence even in the ELT community here in Japan, not just in the States. So let me read that. Educational publishing is subject to massive self-censorship due to a combination of left-wing political correctness and right-wing religious fundamentalism, according to Diane Ravitch in her 2003 book, The Language Police: How Pressure Groups Restrict What Students Learn. Ravitch documents the way that by the end of the 1980s, every publisher had complied with the demands of the critics, both from left and right. Publishers had imposed self-censorship to head off the outside censors, as well as to satisfy state adoption reviews. Achieving demographic balance and excluding sensitive topics had become more important to their success than teaching children to read or to appreciate good literature. So, and as it says there, has this been going on like since the 80s? And again, to what degree is it still applicable today? Is it better or worse? But especially, to what degree does it apply to our situation here in Japan is something I hope we can think about and discuss. Okay, next. So, as I was saying there, let's think about to what degree does Ravitch's assessment apply to ELT in Japan? And then another important question is, how can we best balance concern for the teacher's freedom of speech with concern for the students' freedom of speech? Because I know, at the beginning in the abstract for today's talk, I was focusing more on students' freedom of speech, but I also realized the degree to which we can support our students is also dependent on how much freedom of speech we have ourselves. And I do recognize, that many of our colleagues do feel they're in vulnerable situations where, no matter how much they may want to support their students, they feel, tied. They feel barriers themselves. And I don't mean to be denying that. And so I just want to try to do a realistic assessment of what we can safely do, and, how we can balance those two concerns. Okay, next. So, but this is also a time where I'd like to pause and ask people to just think for themselves. You don't have to raise your hands here, and no guilt tripping here, okay, but just something to be aware of. How many of us have just given up on either or both, either teachers' freedom of speech and or students' freedom of speech, and just compartmentalized and split into these extremes where, okay, I'll post all this political stuff on my personal Facebook page or my Instagram or whatever, but let's just not go there in the classroom. It's safer, it's more comfortable, but is that really the best way to do our students the best service as educators? Is something that's the hard question for today. No judgments here, okay? And no morality. It's just, that's why, so just to whatever degree you feel comfortable talking about this, but I just want to, throw the questions out there and ask everyone to take them wherever you can. Okay, next. So what I've introduced here again, so this is a little bit more of self-introduction, but it's also maybe some possible alternatives based on my current teaching situation. And I hope this will give you some ideas of maybe then ways you can improvise. And especially what I want to argue here is there are ways to keep these issues alive in the classroom without fearing that you're going to be accused of using your classroom as a soapbox and, brainwashing your students or trying to, persuade them to agree with your politics, because that's not, I don't think anyone here is trying to do that, but you also may have this fear of being misunderstood just because you bring up these things in any way, form, or fashion. So what I want to introduce is some ways that I think some people may look at this as compromise. Some people may be kind of uncomfortable with compromising and want to just, be full out. But I mean, this is something I feel like I learned from Nelson Mandela. And that is the idea that strategic compromise is not necessarily moral compromise. The idea that, just planting seeds, even if you're just not going full blown out, and inviting your students to come to demonstrations with you, that it doesn't have to be those two extreme ends, but there can be, some negotiation in between. So I'd like to give you here just a few examples of what I do after having, taught for like 30 plus years at just one university. So I'm now teaching part-time at 3 different universities with 3 very different groups of students. But I just try to find ways to keep the questions alive in all of these situations. So I just want to give one example from each of those situations as concrete examples. So I teach one class on classical Japanese literature and one class on Japanese pop culture. It's a 2-semester thing, but because it's a class for international students, it's not a year-long course because some students come in the spring and some come in the fall. So they're independent, 2 independent courses. But for example, in the class on classical Japanese literature, I teach about the No drama. And so that's an example there. But the nice thing about teaching the No drama is not only are you teaching the classics, that were written like 600 years ago, but there is also a contemporary movement called New No, where artists are writing plays about new topics, including some controversial topics. There was a New No play about brain death, where it was imagining the ghost on the stage for that No play was someone who had been declared brain dead. Their heart had been taken out of their body and then transplanted into someone else's body. And it imagined that actually the brain dead person really knew what was going on. So bringing up lots of really, important issues like that, ethical issues like that. And the image you see there is a wonderful play about a rabbi from Israel who takes a Russian immigrant on a tour of the Holy Land, and they meet the ghost of the Samaritan woman who gave water to Jesus at Jacob's well. And it's not taking sides. It's just, it's having all 3 of those perspectives. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, but just bringing those kinds of even introducing a play like that in the course of one lecture. I don't have them read the play, but when I just introduce a selection of what kind of new plays there are now, we've got plays about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we've got plays about forced Korean labor during World War II, and just giving them as options for the students to follow up as they may please. And then the center idea about the SDGs, I know some people can be kind of skeptical or maybe even cynical about the SDGs, but I think a lot of people, and there are a lot of commercial textbooks now that introduce the SDGs, and I've used, I think, 3 of them. And I talked about this in a Tokyo Jolt presentation once, but The problem is most of the textbooks, and I think a lot of people who, have tried to familiarize themselves with the SDGs, they they only read the 17 goals and they don't read the preamble. And so the preamble actually has some really deep points that are not in the 17 goals, which the 17 goals, frankly, are basically lowest common denominator because all the participating countries had to agree. So especially the SDG on gender, it's mostly about women and girls. It doesn't talk a lot about sexual minorities, for example. So there are, and it's because they could not come to enough of an agreement, a consensus to include that. And they just had to go with the best, they could. And we just have to build on by being critical and building on it as best we judge. But I would like to just point out this one paragraph from the preamble to the 2030 agenda. It says, we call for further effective measures and actions to be taken in conformity with international law to remove the obstacles to the full realization of the right of self-determination of peoples living under colonial and foreign occupation, which continue to adversely affect their economic and social development, as well as their environment. So, I always try to, even if I'm using a commercial textbook that doesn't include this, I will try to work this into my introduction. Okay, and then finally, the last examples from a course I do for students in the Department of Public Policy. And what I do there is we have some fun with popular culture where we will look at movies and music, and we will talk about the degree to which popular culture can affect public opinion, and to what degree that may then go on and actually affect public policy by affecting voter behavior. And so here, I tend to not to try to show I'm keeping up with all the latest, youth culture. I actually deliberately choose old examples like Elvis, even though I'm not quite old enough to be first generation Elvis fan myself. But, I talk about his connection with the civil rights movement and how he wrote, he was so devastated. If you've seen the Buzz Luhrmann movie, you know that he was so devastated by the death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. That he wrote this song called "If I Can Dream," which is clearly referencing Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream." So Elvis was asking, if I can dream, why can't everyone have the same dreams I can? But then I just take that as a starting point, as a warm-up exercise, and then invite the students to bring things in themselves. Okay, next. So let's move into our first breakout rooms. I'll be asking Edward to move you into groups of 3. And these are the 3 questions I'd like to ask you to talk about with your partners. So first of all, I do encourage you to just take a little time to calculate your score there on the Wheel of Privilege, as I did. Please feel free to chat as you do so, but you do not have to share your score. Okay, this is not a shame game, but just be aware of it, okay, and aware of maybe the resistance you may feel at being categorized, right? So a lot of these exercises today are related to recognizing our resistance. Okay, and then I encourage you to share ways you've tried to leverage your privilege in the past. And then finally, to brainstorm, okay, at least one way, maybe you could leverage it a little more. Okay, so I'd like to, yes.
How do we calculate? What are the point values? So
yeah, there are 12 slices of the pie there. So I was just calculating one for each time you were. The way I calculated my 11 out of 12 is 1 point for every time I was in the highest, closest to privilege. And then you could just increment, less and less if you were closer out to the margins.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I was only, because I was so much in the center, I wasn't thinking about those. So thanks for that question. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to read through it once and tell a little bit about it, and then I'd like to do a guided meditation where I'll ask you to close your eyes and listen. But first, let's just look through. I mean, Gandhi, he would he just had these little cards, and they were handwritten or maybe block printed, but anyway, and he would just stand out on the streets or the roads and just hand these cards to people, passing by. And it became, quite a movement. But let me first just read through it. I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt or the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest person whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to them. Will they gain anything by it? Will it restore them to a control of their own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to swaraj, or self-determination, for the hungry and spiritually starved millions? Then you will find your doubt and yourself melting away. So what I'd like to do is now, as we start moving into how we can, take some of the ideas you had in your breakout rooms and sort of actually put them into practice, I'd like to do this guided meditation with you twice. And I will read and I will ask you to close your eyes and just listen and meditate. So I'm going to read it twice. And the first time, instead of saying person, I'm going to say teacher. And then the second time, I'm going to say student. So, there's no limits to who you imagine. You may imagine someone who's neurodivergent. You may imagine someone, who is a member of a sexual minority. You may imagine someone who needs, special support with either, mental or physical needs. It's up to you, just whatever you imagine, and then hold that person in your mind. Okay, so please close your eyes. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest teacher whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to them. Will they gain anything by it? Will it restore them to a control of their own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to their self-determination? Okay, next, recall the face of the poorest and the weakest student whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to them. Will they gain anything by it? Will it restore them to a control of their own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to their self-determination? Okay, so thank you for being open to that. And I hope that also leads to some more discoveries, especially as we move now into our role play scenarios. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, I have two very simple role plays here for you. I think they're pretty simple, but I'm not sure how the sharing in the breakout rooms works. So if you're not sure you can remember it, you might want to take a screenshot of it now. I will read through it, and please feel free to take a screenshot as I read. Okay, so there are two possibilities here. In the first one, a student, or perhaps a small group of students, comes to you and they say, We want to hold a showing of this movie, but because we are not an officially recognized circle, we need a professor's signature to use a classroom. Can you be our sponsor? So I want you to think about what you would say if a student or a group of students came to you with such a request. And I have put a few examples there. You're not limited to these examples, but as I said at the beginning of the presentation, because we're all about challenges today and getting out of our comfort zone and make sure that we're not keeping our students in such a safe little bubble in their classrooms that they're not really learning and growing, because we want them to grow. So some of the examples I've put here, but you feel free to make your own choices, are Paris is Burning, Tootsie, The Danish Girl, Disclosure, Lemon Tree, Five Broken Cameras, Till Kingdom Come, My Small Land. You may know all of these, you may know none of them, you may only know one or two, but and you may have another idea, but as I say, the idea is to help you visualize what you would do in this situation if a student came to you and made such a request. And then I'm going to go ahead and explain the second one as well. And when you're working with your partner, you can split up the time and do them, just work out with your partner how you want to do them. But the second was a little different. Imagine a student or maybe a group of students comes to you and says, we want to hold a silent candlelight vigil to commemorate an incident or an event. But because we are not an officially recognized circle, we need a professor's signature to use the lawn. It's an outdoor event with candles. Okay, can you be our sponsor? So here probably, incidents or events that are more familiar to you than maybe some of the movies were. Okay, the coup d'etat in Myanmar, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, the death of Wishma Sandamali. Okay, before you go into your breakout rooms, I just want to give a couple of caveats. So next screen, please. Okay, so when you do these role plays with your partner, this time we'll just have pairs, okay, 2 people in each breakout room. First of all, if you have had similar experiences and you choose to share some of your own firsthand experience, just be sure to anonymize, okay, omit names and any other identifying information. But the main thing I really want you to do with this exercise is to monitor your comfort level. Okay, if you feel yourself resisting, getting uncomfortable, think about it. Okay, look at it. Where is the resistance coming from? And if you face that resistance and think about it, think about how working with that resistance can help you grow professionally. Okay, you want to go back to the previous slide maybe one more time and make sure everyone got a chance to take a screenshot if you need it, and then go into breakout rooms in pairs. And if there's an odd number, just maybe one group of 3. Maybe I just make a final comment about the first book I have there on the reference list, I've Got Your Back. The thing I love about this book is that it's mainly about harassment and intervening, not just being a bystander, but, intervening when you see someone being harassed. But, it really helps you develop a sense of being able to judge whether or not you should intervene, depending on the situation that you're witnessing, but also how, if you decide, yes, I've got to do something, I've got to intervene, the best way. And what it does is it trains you through scenarios like the ones I used in my presentation today. And what it encourages you to do is to find your superpower. and to figure out the kind of skill that you have where you could be most effective. And so I think, just as we want to be effective teachers, we also want to be effective in maintaining a healthy learning atmosphere where, students feel free to express themselves, and our peers, feel free to express themselves. So I really do recommend that book. That'll help you develop your own professional skills as well as supporting your peers and your students.
Mm-mm. Absolutely. I think you've recommended this book to me before.
Terry and I used this in our DEI presentation at Colbridge Alt last year.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, I really recommend it.
All right. Well, Gerry, thank you for a wonderful workshop, giving me a lot of things to think about. This kind of opportunity is for anyone in the Kyoto chapter who wants to share something with the members. So if you are a Kyoto member, please hit us up and we can organize a session like this for you. Yeah. They will always be online because it's hard for us to get a in-person venue these days. In the chat, there's a link to some announcements from our chapter. We've got our officer elections coming up, and you can see who is running for each position. If you're interested and you want to team up with one of us and learn the ropes, please join. We need as many people on hand as possible. And then we have some events coming in November. At the beginning of November, we'll announce the election results, and also Anna Sophia Hoffmeyer from Kansai University is giving a featured talk. And then in December, we have our AI event where some teachers will, let's see, we've got Kondo University of Foreign or International Studies, another teacher from Waseda, and then my colleague Paul Rain, who works at Ritsumeikan, will be discussing use of AI in the language classroom, specifically, mostly, I think, ChatGPT, and it'll provide an opportunity for us to discuss the issues, both good and bad. So if you are around and free, please join us for those events coming up in the fall. And otherwise, let's give Gerry a big round of applause and thank you
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, officers, for joining.
Thank you.
Miso.
Thank you.
Tomato for joining us.